Israeli says, that's not very brave. That's not very courageous. It's not very impressive. Who are the people they killed? The total was those Hamas terrorists who Israel killed. Well, one very good Israeli journalist who knows Gaza quite well, he said, who did we kill on the first day? You know, those 200? He says, among the 200 we killed, and now I quote him, were 70 traffic cops at their graduation ceremony. Young men in desperate search of a livelihood. Remember, this is Gaza. 50% unemployment. 50% food insecure. Young men in desperate search of a livelihood. Young men with no future. In Gaza, you can't get married unless you can support a family. You're looking for a job, just the minimum in life, the pleasure and the gratification of a family. 50 traffic cops at their graduation ceremony. Young men, writes the Israeli journalist, in desperate search of a livelihood, who thought they'd found it in the police and instead found death from the skies. Was it an accident? Was it what they like to call the fog of war? No, the Israelis were very honest. They wrote in their newspapers, we spent several months deciding whether or not we were going to blow up that graduation ceremony. And after thinking about it and arguing about it, discussing it, we decided, yes, we're going to go ahead and kill those 70 traffic cops in desperate search of a livelihood. As Israel targeted schools, mosques, hospitals, ambulances, UN sanctuaries, as it flattened entire neighborhoods, as it slaughtered and incinerated Gaza's defenseless civilian population, the Israelis didn't pretend what it was all about. One of them said, Gaza is to Lebanon as the second sitting for an exam is to the first. A second chance to get it right. And this time, he said, Israel had hurled back at Gaza not just 20 years, like they did in Lebanon in 2006. They hurled back Gaza 60 years to the 1940s. Electricity is available only for a few hours a day. And then another one wrote, Israel has regained its deterrence capacity because the war in Gaza has compensated for the shortcomings of the 2006 Lebanon war. And a third one said, there is no doubt that Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah is upset these days. There will no longer be anyone in the Arab world who can claim that Israel is weak. Notice, unlike what Cameron said, and most of you heard, the Israelis don't even pretend it had anything to do with the rocket attacks. The problem was, we have to get the Arabs to be afraid of us again. And the best way to get them to be afraid of us is by showing them that if you mess with us, if you get out of hand, if you get out of line, do you see what we did in Gaza? Remember that white phosphorus we dropped on the hospital, on the school, on the warehouse? Well, we're going to do the same thing to you if you get out of hand. That was to make sure that Israel could restore its deterrence capacity. And the second reason, and that's where I'm going to leave off, the second reason is what I mentioned at the very beginning. The entire international community, for better or for worse, you can agree or disagree, the entire international community has reached the conclusion the only way to resolve this conflict, two states on the borders that you see, the purple being the Israeli state, the green being the Palestinian state. And in recent years, the Arabs said, fine, we're willing to accept it, and even Hamas said, we're willing to accept it. I want to just read, since now that some of you have the background, I just want to read a statement by the leader of Hamas, because I think you'll understand now what he was trying to say. About a year ago, now in March 2008, the leader of Hamas, and a person named Khalid Mashal, he said as follows. He said, there's an opportunity to deal with this conflict in a manner different than Israel, and behind it, the U.S. is dealing with it today. There's an opportunity to achieve a Palestinian national consensus and a political program based on the 1967 borders. Those are the 67 borders, in which most Palestinian forces, including Hamas, accept a state on the 1967 border, a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. The Arabs also agreed to this, but no one is taking advantage of this opportunity. No one is moving to cooperate with this opportunity. Now you remember, most of you said, I don't think that's very fair, that resolution, the one that Danielle proposed, and I said the UN has endorsed. And now the head of Hamas says, even this minimum, we're willing to accept 20%. We'll accept just 20%. He says, even this minimum that has been accepted by the Palestinians and the Arabs has been rejected by Israel and by the US. And that was the problem for Israel, that the Palestinians were becoming too moderate. I know that sounds strange, but that was the problem. The Palestinians were becoming too moderate. They were saying, okay, we'll give up on the whole of Palestine, just to 20%, the West Bank and Gaza. But Israel did not want to give up the West Bank. As I mentioned earlier, they already brought in 500,000 settlers. They're taking the water. They're building a wall. They're taking about 12% of the West Bank, the best land, the water. They don't want to give up the West Bank. And so they decided that we have to get rid of Hamas, because if Hamas keeps saying we're ready to settle, then pressure will build on Israel. People will say, okay, Israel, you always claim there's nobody to negotiate with. But now Hamas says it's willing to negotiate. And Hamas says it will accept just the 20%. And Israel will no longer have an excuse not to negotiate. But it doesn't want to negotiate if negotiations mean it has to leave the West Bank, which it refuses to do. And so they went into Gaza trying to get rid of Hamas, and therefore they'll be able to say there's nobody to negotiate with. And that, I think, were the main aims of Israel. But what I think is fairly certain, we could say, are 2 points. Number one, it had nothing to do with the rocket attacks, because if Israel didn't want the rocket attacks, it wouldn't have broken the ceasefire that caused the rocket attacks. And, well, we'll leave it at that, and now I'd like to hear from you. Thank you. who have dissenting or not just dissenting opinions, but where they're not sure, they're not convinced, and they want me to make a more convincing argument than they already have, if they're not convinced. So let's hear from them first. Yes?
Why do you think Israel is a part of Israel?
Excuse me?
Why do you think they supporting Israel?
The question is, why do I think the U.S. of A. supports Israel? And I think that there's not one answer to everything. In my opinion, the United States has no real interest in the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. So if tomorrow Israel were to say, we're packing our bags and we're leaving, we're going back to the purple area, and we're going to let the Palestinians have a state in the green area, I think Barack Obama, like his predecessors, Bush, Carter, Clinton, they would all be perfectly happy with that. Because why would they want Israel to build settlements in the occupied territory, steal the water? They have no real stake. So there, I do think the main reason the U.S. supports Israel is because of the Israel lobby. You know, lobbies can have power in our country, everyone knows. That's why people can walk around with a gun in the United States, because of a gun lobby. So I think it's the lobby. On the other hand, both the Israel and the United States have a common interest in trying to control the Arab world. Because the Americans, they have this idea, the US government, they have this idea that the resources in the Arab world belong to us. But by some strange quirk of fate, they're located under Arab soil. But they're really ours. And when anyone in the Arab world gets the idea that their resources belong to them, they have to be put in their place. It has nothing to do with religion. It's just very silly. In the 1950s, the main enemy of the United States was not Islamic fundamentalists. It was what they called back then radical Arab nationalists, people like President Nasser in Egypt. Now, Nasser used to take the fundamentalists like the Muslim Brotherhood in his country. He used to put them in torture chambers and kill them. But he had the idea that the Arab world should belong, or its destiny should be decided by the Arabs. And that was called a radical Arab idea. And nowadays, it's the same thing with Iran. We don't care that Iran is fundamentalist. It's just silly. Because the most fundamentalist regime is clearly Saudi Arabia, which is our main ally. It has nothing to do with whether you are religious or irreligious, Muslim or Christian, secular or religious. The only issue that concerns the United States is whether you follow our orders or you don't follow our orders. If you don't follow our orders, then you have to be cut down to size. And Israel, too, wants to control the Arab world, along with the United States, of course. And so they have a common interest. So, for example, in that 2006 war in Lebanon, many of you will remember Israel went in to try to destroy the Hezbollah, and the United States was blocking any United Nations resolution to end the Israeli attack. Because both the US and Israel wanted to inflict a defeat on Hezbollah, hoping it would prepare the ground for an attack on Iran. So, when it comes to the Arab world in general, I think there is an overlapping of interest between the US and Israel. when it comes to just the Israel-Palestine conflict, I don't think there's any U.S. interest. I think it's the Israel lobby.